Assalamu alaikum class. So this lecture is about meninges and dural venous sinuses. So in this lecture, I'm going to cover two topics. One is the meninges, which are known as the covering of the brain and spinal cord, and other one is basically the dural venous sinuses, which are the major venous sinuses, which are present within these meningeal layers, responsible to drain the entire CNS central nervous system that includes brain and spinal cord. So objective of this lecture is basically first we'll cover the meninges, which includes three layers. The outermost is known as the dura mater. The middle one is known as the arachnoid matter, and the innermost one is known as the pia matter. Then we'll talk about the dural venous sinuses and the meninges of the spinal cord. So this is basically the layer of this head we're talking about here. So if I'm coming from outside and I'm coming within this the head region. So the first layer that I will encounter is going to be scalp, which is entirely a different topic, which we'll cover in head and neck. Then comes the part where you have skull. Now, if you talk about skull, skull has two tables. One is known as the outer table, the other is known as the inner table, and in between there is another type of bone in between. Then we have the dura mater. Now, if you can clearly see, the dark blue layer is basically the dura mater, both of them. So it has the outer layer of the dura mater known as the periosteal dura mater, and the inner layer which is known as the meningeal dura mater. Then just below the dura mater, you can find another layer that is known as the arachnoid matter. Then after that, you will have the pia mater, which is closely attached to the underlying cerebrum or any nervous tissue. So obviously, there would be spaces between these things, which we'll talk about. For example, just above the dura mater, there would be the epidural space. Below the dura mater, there would be the subdural space, and then below the arachnoid matter, there would be the subarachnoid space. And there's no space between pia mater and cerebral cortex because it's closely attached to it. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about: the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. This is the outermost layer, this is the middle layer, and this would be the innermost layer. Now, first let's talk about the dura mater. Now, dura mater is, as I just told you, it's the outermost layer of the meninges of both brain as well as the spinal cord. And as I just told you, it has two layers, endosteal layer and the meningeal layer. So we're going to first talk about the endosteal layer. Now the endosteal layer, if you can clearly see here, now this layer, this much is the endosteal layer, which is basically present on the inner surface of the skull. So it's basically internally lining the inner table of the skull. So it's like a periosteum covering the inner surface of the skull bones. And at the foramen magnum, which is the major opening of the norma visualis, I hope you guys are done with it. It does not continue to form the dura mater of the spinal cord. So that's important point. Then around the margins of all the foramina in the skull, they become continuous with the periosteum of the outside of the skull bone. So basically, wherever you get a foramen, like you must have seen foramen ovale in the base of skull. So when the this type of endosteal layer of the dura mater comes, it basically goes out and it becomes the periosteum of the skull from the outside. At the sutures, it basically continues with the sutural ligaments, and it's strongly adherent to the bones at the base of the skull. So this is pretty much fixed under the skull. Then comes the part where we have the meningeal layer. Now, if meningeal layer we talk about, meningeal layer is basically this one layer. So this is the layer. So I can clearly tell you that this is where you see a vein. That's the superior sagittal sinus. So these sinuses are basically present between these two, the endosteal and the meningeal layer of the dura mater. So that's why it's basically known as the dura mater proper, because it's more related to the CNS, and it's a dense, strong, fibrous membrane covering the brain. It is continues. This one basically continues to form the dura mater of the spinal cord, and the previous one was not continuing as the dura mater of the spinal cord. That provides the tubular sheet to the cranial nerve, which is passing through the foramen. So the endosteal layer goes and forms the periosteum or the outer skull, while the meningeal layer is responsible to form the sheets that can cover the cranial nerves, and hence they provide protection to those cranial nerves. Outside the skull, the sheets fuse with the epineurium of the nerve, so it becomes part of the nervous system majorly. So now this diagram is basically again from the Snell's anatomy, and you can clearly see the two layers, and you can clearly see the sinuses present within these two layers of the uh, the dura mater. Now, most importantly, what you need to understand here, another thing is that there is another thing that you can see that's called tentorium cerebellar. This is basically a part that demarcates between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So it's like a tent shape folding of the dura mater, both layers, majorly the meningeal layer, and they're responsible to form these partitions or the separation sheets. They're responsible to demarcate between the cerebellum here and cerebrum here. Then if I go next, that's the example that was, see, this is the arachnoid layer. This goes stops here, but if you talk about the meningeal layer of the dura mater, it goes and becomes part of the epineurium of the nerve which is going out from a foramen, while the endosteal layer, this one, it basically goes outside and becomes the periosteum of the skull outside. So dural separation I was just initially talking about. So the meningeal layer basically sends the inward four septa, which divide the cranial cavity into freely communicating spaces, and these spaces they lodge the subdivision of the brain. So you can clearly see it here that you have this separation that clearly demarcates between the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. This is another fox cerebri. And then you have this thing, this is another tentorium cerebellar that is responsible to demarcate your cerebellum from the rest of the brain. So I can clearly, now this, it restricts the displacement of the brain associated with the acceleration and deceleration when the head is moving. For example, if you're going in a car and you're on a 120 speed, that doesn't mean your brain is going to, shake within the skull, and you're going to get an injury, because normally लोग चला रहे होते हैं गाड़ी इतना तेज, but उनकी head injury नहीं होती unless उनका road traffic accident हो जाए. So this basically kind of keeps it restricts the brain displacement when the head is moving. This is another diagram that's taken from Gray's Anatomy, and this is the fox cerebri that's basically demarcating that's a durometer fold, and that's this tentorium cerebellum you can clearly see here. Now, the fox rib is basically a sickle-shaped fold of dura mater that lies in the midline between the two cerebral hemispheres, while the infundibulum is another thing right here. The anteriorly it is attached to the crista galli of the ethmoidal bone and frontal crest of the frontal bone, and posteriorly it is attached to the and blends with the tentorium cerebellar right here. You can clearly see posteriorly it blends with the tentorium cerebellar and it is attached to the ethmoid bone. Right, here I'm talking about the fox cerebri here. Then we have the tentorium cerebellar. Now we'll talk about the tentorium cerebellar. Basically, it's a crescent shape fold of the dura mater responsible to majorly. Let me just remove the marks first. Yeah, it moves over the posterior cranial fossa and covers the upper surface of the cerebellum. So basically, everything below, right here in this cavity, would be the cerebellum, and everything above the tentorium cerebelli would be known as the cerebral hemisphere. So it supports the occipital lobe of the cerebellar hemispheres. Then we have tentorial notch here, right here. Clearly see it. There's a notch. That's the tentorial notch. So it's basically it provides the passage of the midbrain and has an inner free margin border with an outer fixed border. So you have the outer fixed border here. You have the inner free margin here. So this is basically providing the passage of the midbrain to enter into the rest of the diencephalon that you will have in the upper parts of the brain or the higher centers of the brain. Then we have the fox cerebri. Now, fox cerebri is basically a very minute kind of a very smaller separation. Now, this is one of the fox cerebelli. It's a small sickle-shaped fold of the dura mater that is attached to the internal occipital crest right here, and it projects forwards and between the two cerebellar hemispheres. So it's a very minor separation between the two cerebellar hemisphere now. Then we have diaphragmatic sella. Diaphragmatic sella is basically another thing which is right here. It's a small circular fold of the dura mater that forms the roof of the sella turcica. You are pretty much aware with sella turcica. It's the pouch where, or it's basically a depression where the pituitary lies. So it's a small opening in the center which allows the passage of the stalk or the hypophysis cerebri. So this is where it is present. So this is all about the dura mater. Now we talk about the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid matter is the second layer of the meninges. The arachnoid matter is basically a delicate, impermeable membrane which is covering the brain and lying between the pia mater internally and the dura mater, and especially I'm talking about the meningeal layer of the dura mater externally. Then the outer and the inner surfaces of the arachnoid, they're covered with the flattened mesothelial cells. So, if we talk about the spaces, obviously just above the arachnoid matter would be the subdural space because it's going to be below the dura mater, and just below it would be the subarachnoid space that's below the arachnoid matter. So here is one thing that you need to understand here because the subarachnoid space contains the CSF, the cerebro spinal fluid. So here basically, and it's basically this is where you are getting the, what do you call this? These are the basically our arachnoid villi. What are arachnoid villi? Basically, they are the projection of the arachnoid into the venous sinus, which is most commonly in the superior sagittal sinus. So you can clearly see that these are the arachnoidal vessels which are projecting into the sinus here. So this is where it drains the things. Draining occurs. Anyway, so that's the arachnoid granulation, which is basically I'm talking about this thing. These are the collection of the arachnoid villi, which serves as the site where CSF diffuses into the bloodstream. So the thing I was talking about here, this is occurring at the level of arachnoid granulation. Now we talk about the pia mater. Now pia mater is basically, it's a vascular membrane that is covered by the flattened mesothelial cells. It's the innermost layer. You can see in green here. This is pia mater. Now it closely invests in the brain, covering all the gyri and descending the deepest sulci, and extends out over the cranial nerves and fuses with the epineurium as well. And the cerebral arteries, they enter into the substance of the brain. They carry a sheath of the pia mater with them. So everything is going down right here. This is the pia mater. Now the blood supply, the nerve supply of the meninges we're talking about, the arterial supply is done majorly by major arteries of the head and neck region, the internal carotid artery, maxillary artery, ascending pharyngeal occipital, as well as vertebral arteries are responsible to supply the blood to the meninges. The innervation is done by the branches coming from the trigeminal nerve, which is the fifth cranial nerve, vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, and first three cervical spinal nerves. Branches from the sympathetic trunk pass to the dura. Now, now we're coming towards the second point, the second half of the lecture, that's called the dural venous sinuses. Now, these are the specialized type of veins that you can find within the skull on the outer surface of the brain. It's present between the layers of the dura mater, as I told you earlier. They're responsible to drain the cerebral veins. They're responsible to drain the CSF from the subarachnoid space. And they eventually go, their final destination will be the internal jugular vein, which will eventually go and meet the external jugular vein, and eventually they form the superior vena cava. And these are all valveless veins because obviously you're not working here anti-cavity, so they don't need valves. The components are basically, these are the names of the dural venous sinuses that you need to know about. Superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, occipital sinus, cavernous sinus, superior and inferior petrosal sinuses. Now, so first we talk about the superior sagittal sinus. The name is suggesting that it's going to be superiorly placed. It's going to be right in the center, in the midline of the skull. So right here you can clearly see the superior sagittal sinus. It starts behind the frontal bone and goes as long as it can go till the occipital protuberance you have. This is where it meets the other sinuses. That's known as the confluence of the sinus. So location, the upper fixed border of the falx cerebri, obviously it's running on the falx cerebri. This is the falx cerebri, and it extends from foramen cecum anteriorly till the internal occipital protuberance, as I told you here, where it basically terminates and continues to form the transverse sinus, usually right side. And at the internal occipital protuberance, it dilates to form the confluence of the sinus, where all the sinuses meet, some common meeting point basically. So this is the superior sagittal sinus in the coronal view. You can clearly see it here. This is it. Now the most important thing about here, it contains a lot of arachnoid granulation, which I told you earlier. Inferior sagittal sinus, if we talk about, this is exactly the same thing, but it's kind of a shorter, and it's on the inferior margin of the falx cerebri, and this is where it is. So it's also in the midline, the lower free margin of the falx cerebri. It terminates by joins the great cerebral vein and forms a straight sinus right here. So this is the great cerebral vein which is coming, and it forms a straight sinus which is basically reaching towards the confluence of the sinus. When we talk about the straight sinus is basically, again, I just told you about it. It's at the junction of the falx cerebri with the tentorium cerebelli. So right here, where the falx cerebri meeting the tentorium cerebelli right here, this is where it's running. Termination, it basically forms the transverse sinus usually to the left. So basically your superior sagittal sinus is usually forming the right-sided transverse sinus, while the straight sinus is usually forming the left-sided transverse sinus. But of course, these things can vary from person to person. But usually what happens, it's basically this. Then we talk about the tributaries. It's responsible to, obviously, it's formed by the fusion of the inferior sagittal sinus and the great cerebral vein. So obviously these are the two tributaries of the straight sinus. Now from here, now you have the two transverse sinuses, right? The right one and the left one, right here. So these are the paired sinuses which begin at the internal occipital protuberance where the confluence of sinus is present, as usually continuous with the superior sagittal sinus, and the left one is continuous with the straight sinus, as I told you before. The location is basically attached on the tentorium cerebelli, grooving in the occipital bone, and finally posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone. They're going right here at this point. Now what happens here? Now the tributaries, they're responsible to drain the superior petrosal sinus, the inferior cerebral vein, and the cerebellar veins, as well as the diploic vein. So these are the tributaries of it. So they're draining the cerebellum from behind, like from below the tentorium cerebellum, and above they're draining the inferior part or the base of the brain posteriorly. Termination, they continue as the sigmoid sinus right here. You can clearly see it. Then comes the sigmoid sinus right here. It's the sigmoid sinus. You have to remove the tentorium cerebelli in order to expose the inferior to it, the sigmoid sinus. So there's a continuation of the transverse sinuses. They run downwards, medially, and grooves around the mastoid process. They're present behind the mastoid antrum. Then it turns forward and downwards to reach closer to the jugular foramen. Right here, you can clearly see they're going to the closer to the jugular foramen here, and they terminate by draining into the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein. So that's the final result of it. Then you have a minor sinus, occipital sinus, which is present at the attachment of the falx cerebri to the occipital bone. Right here, it drains into the confluence of sinus, and the rest, you know the story. Then we have another sinus that's called the cavernous sinus. It's present on. It's a paired sinus. It's present on each side of the body of the sphenoid and the sphenoid sinuses and the pituitary gland. You already know about it. On each side, you have the cavernous sinus. So when we talk about the cavernous sinus right here, so this is one of the most important sinuses, which, as far as your exams are concerned, because there are a lot of structures which are passing through the cavernous sinus, which will eventually make sense when you start studying the cranial nerves and their courses, and you start studying and relating things to the orbital cavity. So on the lateral aspect, right here, from above downwards, if I'm coming, so third cranial nerve, the oculomotor is going, then you have the trochlear, then you have the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, and then you have the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is the fifth cranial nerve, so we call it as V1 and V2. So this is like a mnemonic. Oh, Tom, right? So O Tom would be your superior to inferior if I'm going. So that would be oculomotor nerve, trochlear nerve, ophthalmic division of trigeminal, and maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. But if I come towards the medial side of this cavernous sinus, so this is known as the cavernous sinus cavity. This is where there are two structures passing through it. One is known as the internal carotid artery, and another thing is basically your abducens nerve. This is the sixth cranial nerve. The internal carotid artery and abducens nerve. These are the two contents of the cavernous sinus cavity. They're running from the medial wall of the cavernous sinus. Now we have intercavernous connections, obviously here. You can clearly see it. And we have the input and the outputs. For example, it's draining the orbital cavity through ophthalmic vein into the cavernous sinus. We have pterygoid plexus, which is also draining somewhere here, coming through here. So we have these are the incoming, and then we talk about the outcoming. So of course, the superior petrosal sinus is right here. It's coming out from the cavernous sinus. Then you also have basilar sinus right here, which is coming out here. Then you obviously have the inferior petrosal sinus as well, which is right here. It's also coming out from the cavernous sinus. So these are the output channels. Eventually, they will also drain into the sinuses, which I've already talked about. So these are the drainage system of the cavernous sinus. Then we have superior and inferior petrosal sinus. The superior and inferior petrosal sinus are the small sinuses situated on the superior as well as the inferior border of the petrous part of the temporal bone, which you have already heard about. And each superior drains into the cavernous sinus, drains the cavernous sinus into the transverse sinus, while each inferior sinus or inferior petrosal sinus drains the cavernous sinus into the internal jugular vein. So you know the major story here. Now, lastly, in this lecture, this is the meninges of the spinal cord. They are just going to be the dura and the arachnoid and the pia mater, which basically you already have done the spinal cord. There's a phylum terminale here. That's the extension of the dura mater. So this is conus medullaris. So those who know about the spinal cord now, they know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to tell you that there is no difference between the meninges of the spinal cord and the brain, because there's only one difference, because the end ostial layer of the dura mater does not continue as the meninges of the spinal cord. So that's the only difference. Otherwise, the layering and the spaces are the same. So this was all about the meninges and the dural venous sinuses. If you have any queries, please let me know. Thank you.